Hi, everyone. Welcome to lecture guide number 3, where you'll be happy about the relatively short lecture this week, where we're just going to be covering the late Gothic to early Renaissance period in painting. And really, this is a smooth kind of transition between the two. By the way, if you're wondering about my eye, I got elbowed playing soccer the other night, so I've got a pretty good shiner here. And my voice. I'm fighting off a cold. Anyway, bear with me this week. So the most important thing about this week that we want to start talking about, and it will be a part of the next 4 or 5 lectures, is the emergence of the Renaissance in Western Europe. Starting around 1300, obviously there's no hard and fast dates on these types of things, and progressing all the way through, frankly, the 16th century, where it starts to deteriorate with new stylistic forms, such as Mannerism, and eventually gives way to the Baroque period. But in any case, remember how we started off this class by supposing that the things that are going on in the world at the time that the art is produced have some kind of impact on that art, right? That the historical context, belief system, shifts, big wars, plagues, whatever it might be, have some kind of impact or are represented or reflected in the works of art that are produced in that time period. Now, there's a couple parts to this then. One part to this that we'll cover right off the bat is what's going on in the world and what are some of the big shifts that lead people of the 1300s to start calling their own period the Renaissance, which literally means rebirth. And rebirth of what? And we've said this before, right? They were the ones, these Renaissance thinkers, who labeled the Dark Ages so as to set themselves apart from this earlier age. So the first thing we want to talk about in depth is the context. And this week, for your summary reflective essay, I'm asking you to summarize all of these big ideas in a nice, tidy essay for me. The second thing that we'll go on to talk about, and this will be the first time we've really gone in depth on this, is what's known as a period style. A period style is a list or grouping of characteristics, a kind of generalization of the visual elements and subject matter and so forth of works of art that were produced during a particular period of time by a particular culture that share in common these general characteristics. Now, the belief here, the basics of this art historical methodology is that because people believed the same thing during this context, because they were producing works of art for specific patrons who had specific tastes in mind, that we can find general characteristics within, let's say 100-year span sometimes, maybe even more than that, that much of the art of that time period shares in common. And again, we call this a period style. So the period style and the context are very closely aligned. Now, also remember, though, that this is a generalization, that when we talk about a period style, it's a shorthand way that I can say, hey, I'm talking about the early Renaissance or the Quattrocento or the High Renaissance. And since I will have already listed all the stylistics of that period, I won't have to enumerate them every time I bring up that term. So let's go back then to the context of the rise of the Renaissance, this rebirth. First of all, what does rebirth mean? Rebirth of what? Well, what these thinkers and people of the time believed their own period was a rebirth of after the fall of the Roman Empire and the so-called Dark Ages, which frankly weren't that dark. They believed that their time period was a rebirth of classical forms of education and learning, of classical philosophy and the arts that embody these forms, of new forms of government, and by and large, we kind of group this all under the idea of the rebirth of humanism. And I'll come back to humanism in a minute, But the basic idea of humanism can be summed up by that famous phrase, man is the measure of all things. It is up to us to perfect ourselves. I'll come back to this in a minute. Now, always, when we see these big historical shifts in belief systems, and these are still very, very religious people, so to say that they're humanistic doesn't mean that they've stopped believing in God or that they believe any less in God. They believe just as much in God as they once did. They just start thinking about humanity as more important than they had before. They start thinking about humanity and us as more than just this world, as more than just a testing ground where we, try to avoid sin and do good things and just kind of, go through life as a big test so that we can get into heaven. They think of it as more than that. They start to think that this world is a place where God wants us to be to make ourselves the best person that we can be. This is in terms of both morals, but also in terms of education, in terms of perfecting, government institutions, and of course, perfecting the arts. It's about making this world a kind of mere reflection of the order of the divine up in heaven. And all of us have a part to play. Now, they still are a very stratified society, but we'll come back to this in a minute. So if you think about it that way, and you think that each person not only is individually in charge of making themselves better, but making the whole world around them better, that's what we mean by humanism. So where does this reinterest in early classical cultures, Greece and Rome in particular, who were very humanistic, who, this was a huge part of their belief system. Why did that happen at this time period? Well, one of the big things that occurs, and I made mention of it before, is, during the medieval period, generally speaking, Western Europe is ruled by the feudal system. Remember that system in which there are hierarchies, kind of social orders, in which at the very top there's a landed aristocracy and a monarchy. And then below that is the vassal class, and then below that the vast majority of people who are serfs or peasants. And remember how I said that for the most part, it's very hard, if you're a serf or a peasant, to move from that class of people to any other class, to the vassal class, and certainly not to the landed aristocracy or the monarchy, who are all born into their wealth. And honestly, just to give you an anecdote to make this make sense, think of how many fairy tales you've heard, and these all derive from the medieval period, in which some poor, peasant person is suddenly discovered to be the son of a great knight or the daughter of a great king and rises to, glory. That's because for the vast majority of the people, that was a dream, but it was never a reality. So one of the things that shifts, and it starts during the medieval period, and it really gets going in the 1200s into the 1300s, and all the way through the periods that we'll be covering going forward in this class, is that we have the rise of what we call the middle class. And now this middle class isn't like you or I. These middle class people are basically people out of the vassal class or the trading class who, had set up, for instance, trade routes for their aristocratic lords, and secured those trade routes to anywhere from, the Near East to the Far East to Africa or whatever, so as to make some money. And after they had set up those trade routes, they started to figure out that they didn't need to be the middleman anymore, that mercantilism and trade and, they had all the contacts. They should just do it for themselves and make a lot of money at this, which they did. And over the course of, just a couple of generations, because Europe becomes a fairly stable place at this time, big families rise to prominence because they've made a boatload of money off of trade. And then they do something that's a little bit peculiar by Catholic standards. They begin to establish, the big families anyway, banks. They've got a bunch of money. What do you do with that money? Well, there's only so much you can do with it at this point. One of the easiest ways to make more money is to establish a family bank and to lend out that money and to charge interest for that money and make money off the interest. Now, I say that's a little bit peculiar because for Christians, this is called usury. Usury, let's see, USUERY, something like that. You'll be able to look it up in the book. Is charging interest for any money that is lent. And it's against the Christian rules. It's a venal sin. It's something, actually, it might even be a mortal sin, in which you don't go to heaven if you do these types of things. But as has always been the case throughout the history of religion, even some of the most religious people are willing to cut some corners or believe that's just a rule that the church put in place, and to continue to lend money and make boatloads of money off of this. So we have the rise of this middle class, and then we have something else that occurs almost simultaneously. Now, if you look at this map, this is what Western Europe looks like, basically from about 1300 through 1500 or so. You can see that, Italy, which is where most of the story takes place, is not the modern country that it is today. It's a number of different city-states, the biggest kingdom being Naples down at the boot end, and then the papal states around Rome, and then Florence is one of the big centers, as well as Milan up here, where art gets produced. In any case, back to our story, one of the other big things that happens kind of at the same time of the rise of the middle class is that the Byzantine Empire, over here in this part of the world, which at 1500 has already been taken over by the Ottoman Empire, but at the start of our story in 1300 is still very much the Byzantine Empire. People in Constantinople, which is right over here in modern-day Istanbul, which was the center of learning and very close to the classical world, look at Greece is right here, began because of the threat of the Ottoman Empire, who were Muslims, to move out of the Byzantine Empire and bring with them arts and their education texts, including all the classical philosophers. And if you've never read Plato or Aristotle or Socrates, remember they talk more about government and the best type of government and politics and social order than they do, frankly, about anything else. And they're bringing all these ideas with them and returning to Rome, which for the first time in a long time is a very stable place, very protected, not being taken over every couple of years. So why is this important? Because a lot of the philosophy, a lot of the text and the art that they're bringing with them is classical art from Greece in particular. And this art form and what you can find in those philosophical texts is all very humanistic. For instance, the philosophy of Plato or Aristotle is all about how do we become the best people that we can be. And the art forms that are produced by the Greeks and also, frankly, the Romans are idealizations of the perfect human form. In other words, they don't just represent an average person, they represent the most perfect person. And these are both very humanistic in that we try to be the best that we can be. And here we have past models of public and civic and philosophical kind of, exemplary actions that we can look back to and emulate in the present. Now, that's a slow process, but it gets going right during this time period for today's lecture. So to recap part of this, number one, we have the rise of the middle class. Now, middle class who have, and this is the important part, who have, through their own hard work and ingenuity and using their minds and so forth, have gotten what they've gotten because of that. They have done all the work. They've educated themselves. They've gone out and established connections. That's very humanistic. That's a totally different world order than the feudal system in which people are born into their station in life. The aristocrats just think, as does the monarchy, I'm better than other people because I come from better bloodlines. Now we've got a group of people who are better than other people because they work harder than other people, because they educate themselves, because they're, smart and they make connections and they know how to make money into more money. And if that's the case, you can see why they would like a humanistic philosophy, because just as they raised themselves up through their own hard work, pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They want philosophies of life and, frankly, art forms that reflect that humanistic philosophy. Along with that, now they're getting models for that. They're getting basically texts that teach them how to do that or give them, in a pagan way, because Plato and Aristotle and the Romans weren't originally Christian, give them examples of how they might perfect themselves. And the art forms as well provide examples for art forms that might be reflections of this humanistic philosophy. So that's the basics of the context. Right around 1300, so a little bit before this, the Ottoman Empire puts pressure on Constantinople that leads to a mass migration all the way into Rome. The second mass migration will happen in the middle of the 15th century when the Ottoman Empire finally takes over the Byzantine Empire, or most of what was the center of the Byzantine Empire, and more Christians from the Orthodox Church flock to Rome and bring more examples of classical philosophy and classical arts to the area that today we know as Italy. So what does this look like in our art? Right? Well, if we start here, this is a work by Duccio di Buonasegna, known as the Rucellai Madonna. And in a lot of ways, and by the way, you should just be aware, these are giant works of art. This one's like 8 feet tall, if not more. These works of art look a heck of a lot like the paintings that were produced all the way through the Byzantine Empire. So from 700 CE all the way up to this time period, we could literally find tens, if not hundreds of thousands of paintings that look a little bit like this. And what I mean by that is these are altar pieces that were meant to sit or hang above an altar and basically be a visual guide while you're contemplating the religious sermons that were taking place in front of the altar. They're basically kind of like a visual aid to your contemplation of religious dogma. And as I said before, during the medieval period, the interest is not in making figures look realistic or even naturalistic, right? Things that look like things in our real world, because they're not supposed to be human. They're supposed to be an idea. And remember, that fits in perfectly with this worldview that this world doesn't really matter so much other than being a testing ground for us getting into heaven. So over and over again, we represent the same type of iconography. In the center here, you have the Virgin Mary in a deep blue robe. She's seated on a throne so that we think about her as Queen of Heaven, which she will be after her death. On her lap is the Christ child, who is already at the ripe old age of, I don't know how old he's supposed to be here, but let's be generous and say 2 years old, blessing everyone. He's more like a man-child, right? And flanking them on this throne are a bunch of angels, once again, emphasizing the idea that this is spiritual and not to be thought of as real human beings. Further, the frame here, if you're wondering why it has a pointed top, it's the same idea that I talked to you about last week. This is meant to reference the Catholic Church itself. And with the image here of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child, emphasize the idea that Mary housed the Holy Spirit just as the Church housed the Holy Spirit during Mass. Going further than this, what would this mean to someone looking at it? Well, what this means is these are what are called presentation scenes, and this is the Rucellai Madonna again. It means that in presenting Christ to us, Mary shows that our salvation is there awaiting us. That all we need to do now, because Christ has come and he will die for our sins, is follow his word and we'll make it into heaven. So in other words, this is just an emblem of the promise that Christ brings, and if we follow his teachings, we get into heaven. So there's very little emphasis on realistic forms. However, if we were to look at the long tradition of Byzantine painting in relation to things that were produced in 700 or 800 or 900 CE, this does start to show a little bit more naturalism. Remember what that term naturalism means. Realism would be something that looks exactly like what the painting is copying. Naturalism, which is kind of always the case, is something that looks like, generally speaking, a human being, but is not based on any individual likeness. And these are more naturalistic. Now, what do I mean by that? Getting a little bit closer to Mary, still looks like, and you'll, if you've seen Byzantine icons, you'll recognize his face. She looks like slightly alien. These really almond eyes, a very, very kind of prominent bridge to her nose, very small lips, elongated fingers that are very elegant and so forth. It's all based upon the Gothic tradition. But Christ, who is supposed to be, God made human, starts to look a little bit more like a real human being. And by that I mean his facial features are not stylized. He doesn't have, exceptionally almond eyes. The bridge of his nose isn't exaggerated. He looks like a kind of, frankly, man-child, but still he looks like a human being. One of the ways that the artist has been able to achieve this is through what's known as modeling. Modeling is when, if you look at my cursor, areas that are further away from a light source are shaded. And the closer they come to a light source, so if we imagine the light source somewhere out here in our space, shining on his face from over here, the closest thing to the light source will be the lightest. And as things get further away from the light source, they get darker. So that's called modeling. The Italians have a special term for this. They call it chiaroscuro, meaning light and dark. And sometimes you'll hear someone throw around the term shading, meaning, again, modeling a form. That's the big thing. We also start to see, as I talked about in the late Gothic period in sculpture, a little indication of a body underneath the drapery of Christ. However, if you look at the Virgin Mary, it's just a really, really flat form. The artist isn't very good at that yet, and of course they're not meaning to be. It's just that Duccio is moving one step closer to naturalism, and as we'll see, a more naturalistic rendering of the human body seems to go along with this rise of humanism in Western Europe at the same time, meaning their interest in humanity and human beings becomes higher than it ever was, and it stands to reason that they would then represent figures that look like more naturalistic human beings. Quickly, I wanted to show you, and this is in your text if you want to more time on it, Duccio's famous Maestà. It's basically the same idea. It's a giant work. It's about 12 feet tall, 11 feet tall or 13 feet wide. It's very, very big. And in this case, again, it's got a presentation scene in the center, and on both sides, the Virgin Mary is flanked by both apostles as well as angels, and then down below are scenes of the life of Christ, and up above are scenes that lead to the birth of the Virgin Mary. This is just one of those extreme versions of an altarpiece. You can see the artist once again emphasizing the correlation between the Virgin's body and the Gothic church, with all these Gothic pointed arches and the pointed forms that you were asked to write about last time, pushing your eye to heaven, but also pointing out the Virgin Mary's body hosted the Christ before it becomes human, just as the church hosts the Holy Spirit. This work doesn't look like this anymore. Most of these panels were sold off individually, and some of them have been brought back to Siena and put in the altar piece, but many of them are still all around Europe. But I just wanted to point this out. If we get in here close on this form, notice something again. It's almost as if you get in on the Virgin Mary. She once again looks like that strange, almost alien creature. The Christ figure, though, looks a lot more realistic than her. She's starting to show a body underneath this. And all the figures around, whether they be saints or angels or prophets or patrons, or in this case, one of the popes, are starting to look more and more naturalistic around this time period, more modeling to the faces, more substantial forms. They look like human beings. And again, this corresponds to that rise of humanism. This form again, or this subject again, later today in this lecture, and it's one that turns up so frequently that I want you to start thinking very carefully about how these subjects are represented by different artists of different time periods and what those differences mean. This subject is the Annunciation, and the Annunciation is that moment in which Gabriel, over here with the wings, the angel, as an emissary of God, comes down to earth and announces to the Virgin Mary that at this moment you're going to incarnate Christ in you. Hail, most favored one, the Lord be with you. She's usually shown praying, which we see her here, to emphasize her holiness. And in this case, you can see coming out of the sky the Holy Spirit, which is represented by the symbol of a dove, coming down in these rays of light. Remember how light is seen as a manifestation of the divine to basically impregnate the Virgin Mary. In this case, notice as well that we have this very, very prominent pilaster here between the two. That's a very common device. It's meant to separate the spiritual realm from which Gabriel comes from the mundane realm or earthly realm in which Mary is. In other words, this is God leaving the spiritual realm and incarnating himself in human form over here. There's other symbolism as well. You'll see behind the Virgin Mary a door. Doors are oftentimes accompany the Virgin Mary in Annunciation scenes because with this birth of Christ that will be coming, a door is open for all of us to heaven. Because remember, with Christ and his sacrifice, original sin is wiped away and we all get to go to heaven. Over here as well, the Virgin Mary has two of the kind of prominent colors you'll see her in over and over again: blue for her royalty and red for her so-called passion. The passion is not only the love that she bears for Christ, but also the sorrow that she'll have with his death. To turn the altarpiece around and look at the other side, you would see all of these scenes from the Bible there, and you can probably see right in the center a crucifixion scene, right? So lots of storytelling now going on too. These, by the way, are components of the period style of the early Renaissance. Even though this is usually considered to be a late Gothic, early Renaissance work, these are part of the stylistics. So let's start enumerating the stylistics of the early Renaissance. Remember, the subject's a no-brainer. The subject is almost always going to be in the early Renaissance Christian subject matter. That's part of the style. Number two, a rise in the degree of naturalism. That naturalism is both modeled forms that look human as well as we'll see more realistic or believable looking spaces in which these figures are instead of the flat linear quality of the medieval period. Number three, in the early Renaissance, there is a desire to teach through art, what we call didacticism, meaning to teach. And in this case, narrative cycles, meaning lots of different episodic tales, so narratives from the Bible, rather than just one image of the Virgin Mary sitting with the Christ child on her lap, become very popular in the early Renaissance because lower class people who couldn't read would be brought before these altarpieces and could see the stories basically illuminated in these altarpieces for them to understand. Now remember, we've seen this before in illuminated manuscripts. The big difference is that illuminated manuscripts were not public. People couldn't just go leaf through them. Those are luxury items for the rich. And these are usually installed in public places where people could see them. Now, I made mention in last week that if you're of the lower classes, for the most part, during the Gothic period, you're not allowed into the big cathedrals to just hang out with the upper classes during their mass. Every once in a while, there were special masses for the lower classes to attend if you were a member of the congregation, but for the most part, you were pushed off into smaller little churches. That starts to change, not entirely, but somewhat during the Renaissance period. More and more smaller churches or chapels pop up that are open to at least, once a week to the lower classes to go to, and they could see these visual forms and learn from them. So that's another component of the early Renaissance period. Number four, although we don't see it here, we will see it with the work of Giotto. An interest in showing human emotion which, by the way, will not stay with us all the way through the Renaissance. It's only part of the early Renaissance, is oftentimes used by painters in order to make their images relatable. One of the easiest things for us to empathize with is the facial expression of someone or the body posture of someone. We actually have little mirror neurons in our brains that force us to kind of imagine ourselves in the place of the images that we're seeing. And so that's another component. So again, we've got religious subject matter, meaning Christian subject matter, greater believable spaces and naturalistic bodies in these spaces, didactic forms of art, and an increased interest in human emotions in these works. And you can probably see how these all correspond with humanism. Just taking these out of the panel to show you. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but imagine all the major tales of Christ's life being shown in these panels. And we'll go over a lot of those when we look at the major work of art for this lecture. Step forward a little bit, right around the same time period, but in a slightly different part of the world. This is Cimabue. And mainly I bring in Cimabue and this, again, Madonna Enthroned work, which you could see, again, literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of these things all the way back through the Byzantine period. The reason I bring this in is that Cimabue, or Ceni de Pepi, as he was known, most of these Italian artists have kind of nicknames that they go by, was the teacher of the main person in today's lecture, Giotto di Bondone. And so we're going to show him a little bit. In a lot of ways, this is the same as what you've just seen in Duccio's work. It's a Madonna seated on a throne. That throne is a bit more ornate here and maybe a little bit more believable than in Duccio's work. But something's changed a little bit, which is this figure. Let me show you these next to each other. Here of the Madonna, if we get in here close on her, starts to look a little bit more realistic than Duccio's, meaning it's got a little bit more modeling. Christ, again, maybe one step further in believability, but he's still got all of that kind of decorative patterning to the drapery that you expect to find in the Byzantine period. So maybe not so much. Left, I'm showing you a picture of a Byzantine icon that goes all the way back to the 9th century. And you can see how, not a ton has changed in these centuries. They tend to look the same over and over and over because they're just meant to be for the upper classes to look at as a visual aid to contemplate their religious faith. Giotto's work makes a big forward. We're looking now at the major artist for today, Giotto di Bondone, and his Madonna Enthroned from about 1311 or so. Again, it's a gigantic work. It's an altarpiece meant to sit on an altar or hang behind the altar. This one was freestanding. It's got the same form, right? We've got the triangular top to make that association of the Virgin Mary and the church. But if we start looking at this a bit more, you're going to notice he spends a heck of a lot more time making this figure look realistic. So all the way back on the left, now let's look at Giotto's work. Get in here close on the Virgin Mary. He hasn't gotten away entirely from those stylized almond eyes, but look at how her nose looks more like a real nose, and her face looks more like a real face. He's spending a lot of time modeling this form. A highlight hits the body here, and then everything that's further away from this gets slightly darker until the areas that are the most distant are the darkest, right? You can see a body underneath this drapery. The hands aren't quite as elongated as they were before. Christ, there's a lot of attention made to try to make him look realistic, although, frankly, there's kind of a standard art historical joke. Keep your eye on these children. The artists never get children right, partially because children don't sit still, so you can't get a good model for them, but they also just kind of look awkward and weird. You can see Christ's body underneath this clothing everywhere. He looks like a little man-child again, but it's looking a lot more realistic. And if we move down here to these knees, look at the highlights that hit the knees and the real drapery here, real folds of real drapery. This is a heck of a lot more naturalistic than what you would find in anything before. And of course, Giotto was working for patrons who came out of the middle class and wanted works of art that were more naturalistic and thus corresponded with our humanistic philosophies. For the rest of today's lecture, we're going to spend some time in what's called the Scroveni Chapel. It was once called the Arena Chapel because it was built on an old Roman arena, is the way we would pronounce it. Arena, by the way, just means sand for the Romans in Latin, and we called sports areas arenas just as the Romans did because they would put sand on the floor to soak up the blood of the gladiatorial games, for instance. In the Scroveni Chapel, which is named after the person who built this, we see some of the greatest frescoes produced during the early Renaissance. For a look at this during its own time period when it was built, the Scroveni Chapel over here would have been connected to basically the villa of the Scroveni family that we see over here. It's in Padua in Italy. And this is a kind of artistic rendering of what it would have looked like before modern times. I'm going to pause here for a minute so I can get a drink of water and kind of clear my voice. I'll be right back with you. Okay, sorry about that. My voice is failing. Things first, to walk into this chapel and look from the entranceway, and it's a small chapel, right? It's not a giant church or anything. Made for this family, the Scroveni family. If you were to walk in the entranceway and look towards the altar, this is what you would see. So this is the altar space. Again, just like medieval Gothic cathedrals, you notice that they make use of the rounded arch here as a symbol of heaven. This is the most sacred area of the church where Mass is done. These are the pews off to the side where people would sit. The Scroveni family would allow a congregation of lower class people to come in here and view these frescoes or paintings that you'll see in a moment here, and learn from them. And we'll talk about all the reasons the Scroveni family probably created this in a moment. So let's go through what we're actually looking at and give you some terminology here. Number one, you've heard me use the term fresco. If you've done the reading, which of course you should do before you view any of these lectures, you will know that buon fresco or true fresco is a process, and you can find the details in your text, where artists paint on wet plaster, and you can only paint little areas at a time before it dries, because when you paint on wet plaster, as the plaster dries, the pigments bond much more strongly to the wall than they would if you painted on a dry wall. So that's number one for our terminology. Number two, all of these paintings are arranged in bands, meaning they almost look like comic strips, right? 1, 2, 3 bands. And we call these bands registers, a register. So at the top register up here, the subject matter is all the events that lead up to the birth of the Virgin Mary. Now, the reason that this is important, this is actually a church devoted to 3 aspects of the Virgin Mary: her charity, her chastity, and her obedience, I think, to God. The reason that this is important to tell the story of the Virgin Mary is not only that the Virgin Mary is an important figure, but at this time period, the Catholic Church started to theorize that the Virgin Mary was a pure vessel and she had to be a pure vessel to give birth to Christ, who was born without sin. Now, this isn't in the Bible, so they kind of made it up. But this is where the term the Immaculate Conception first derives. It comes from and refers to, in its original moment, not the birth of Christ, but the birth of Mary, Mary being born without the taint of original sin. And we'll come to that story in a few moments here. The middle register here is the life and the ministry of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and the person who comes to life through Mary. And the bottom register, which is closest to us, are a series of scenes from what is called the Passion of Christ. These are all the scenes of the last moments of Christ's life, like his Last Supper, all the way to his crucifixion and his resurrection. And down at the very bottom, kind of right next to you as you'd be seated here, are scenes, and they're just little paintings of 7 sins and 7 vices on each side. They're all painted in another style, another term that you have to know. It's called grisaille. This is spelled Grisailles. And grisaille painting is a type of painting that paints in grayscale, so it's monochromatic, so it's to mimic the look of sculptures. On the altar wall here, and we'll see close-ups of this in a moment, is an Annunciation scene with God up above. And on the entrance wall, which is also the exit wall, we'll see a scene of the Last Judgment. I wanted to just show you this in advance. The registers, if you're going to look at them, they go this way, right? They go horizontally. But if you look at them next to one another, these are fairly large-scale paintings in which we see different scenes from these different moments. So in the middle register here, you see a scene of what's called the raising of Lazarus, and then down below it, you see a scene from the end of the story of Jesus, right before he's assumed into heaven, called the Noli Me Tangere scene. And they're all basically correspondent to one another, meaning the artist Giotto here has picked the Lazarus scene, which is about Christ's power over life and death, to correspond with Christ being resurrected down here. One of the major scenes that I want to spend some time with here at the start is a huge fresco, which is on the entrance wall, which is also the exit wall, of primarily a Last Judgment scene. We saw the Last Judgment when we were looking at San Lazzaro Tun. Remember how this works? A Last Judgment is the time where the world is cleared of life and Christ comes back as a judge of us all and decides who goes into heaven for all times and who is cast down in the pit of hell with Satan. And you see him in the middle. He's painted in, remember this term, hierarchical scale, to look bigger than everyone else because he's more important. That's an old medieval way of representing things. He's inside again, just as you would see him on the exterior of a cathedral in a mandorla, that kind of body halo, flanked by angels on each side. On each side up here are choirs of angels. The angels are actually divided into different orders known as choirs. We're not going to go into that in this class, but you would go into it if you were doing a lot of research on Catholic religious symbolism. And then off to each side of him are his apostles, and actually the Virgin Mary's in there as well. On his right-hand side, remember, when we have good and evil, or we have better or worse, and it doesn't matter up here because this is all the heavenly realm, so it doesn't matter if you're on the right or left up in this realm. But when you get down below this line, which is another register, into the realm of human life, on the right-hand side are what are known as the elect. The elect are those who are going into heaven, and on the left-hand side are those cast down into hell, and right in the center you have a crucifix scene. So let's get up close here on some of these scenes. Christ, notice that he's looking a lot more naturalistic, looks like a believable body, lots of modeling or chiaroscuro here. He's still in a mandorla, and yeah, he's still in hierarchical scale. That's not very, naturalistic. That's still a cast off to the medieval period, but things are changing a little bit there. Go forward again. One of the things that's most interesting is down here in this realm of the Last Judgment scene, so off on the right-hand side, we see the whole reason that this work was painted. This here is Enrico Scroveni with the white kind of hat, white band on his hat here. And what he's doing is he's offering a scale model of the Scroveni Chapel to the 3 aspects of the Virgin Mary here, the 3 Marys, as what we call an expiatory offering, E-X-P-I-A-T-O-R-Y. Expiate means to wipe away or to alleviate, and in this case, Offering up good deeds was a way to expiate or wipe away one's sins. Helping him out is a Benedictine monk over here, remember about the monasteries, who's probably helped him out figuring out what should be included in these paintings that he then goes on to commission Giotto to paint. So here's the way the Catholic Church works, and we'll see this kind of fall apart and the Protestants split away from the Catholic Church at the beginning of the 16th century because of this. Catholics believe that good deeds can help you get into heaven. Protestants don't. It's the state of your soul and kind of, your inner kind of love of God that's going to get you there. In any case, though, Catholics started to believe that, and they came up with this idea of purgatory, which was just popularized at the same time, just a little bit before this, by Dante Alighieri, who I think you've heard about before. Dante wrote the famous Inferno, where he talks about the circles of hell. And purgatory is this kind of place that's not quite heaven, it's not quite hell. Think of it as an in-between realm made up by Catholics where souls go if they're neither so bad that they should go directly into hell, nor so good that they go directly into heaven, and they wait in purgatory until something tips the scales in their favor. Now, one of the things that can tip the scales in your favor are what are known by Catholics as indulgences. If you did good deeds, if you created, for instance, a chapel devoted to God and you filled it up with frescoes, or you built a building, or you went on a pilgrimage, or frankly, if you just gave money to the Catholic Church, they would grant you indulgences. And these indulgences, and you can see the problem with this, right? It's kind of a pay the Catholic Church and you might get into heaven, could then help you or your ancestors get out of purgatory and get into heaven. Now, Enrico Scriabeni has reason to worry, right? Usury is something that is against the tenets of the Catholic Church, and he has been making a boatload, as his family has, lending money with interest to make more money. So he is trying to expiate or alleviate his sins by creating this. That's one of the big reasons that art was created by the middle class. Another reason, and these things aren't mutually exclusive, by the way, is that they wanted to look good to their public. They're doing this for the benefit of those around them and the benefit of the Catholic Church through, their own virtuous aspirations. They want people to see this, just as you might think, how Paul Allen buys a sports team and wants people to know that he is the, owner of the Seahawks and is doing everything he can to make the Seahawks as good as they can be so that we like him better, right? People have always worried about those things. And that's one of the things that's going on here. Here close too on the hell scene, so I'm going to bring this in close here again. What you'll see are some of the sins. And remember, Dante Alighieri, one of the things that's so cool about the Inferno is that people who go to hell are punished in a way that is relative to the sins that they committed. And so in this scene, people are being punished in hell, and the central figure here is Satan, this kind of purple, demon, bigger than everyone else, almost as big as Jesus up above, who's eating people and twisting their bodies and breaking them and so forth. People are going to be punished based upon what they did in life that was so bad. And so there are scenes in this, for instance, of usurers who are being hung. There are scenes, and by the way, they're being hung by, things that, by bags that hold the money. This is the usurers right here. You can't barely make it out, but these are bags of money that wait and hold the line that then stretches to kill them. This right here, by the way, is the betrayer of Christ. That is Judas Iscariot, who we'll greet in a little bit. And if you get over here, for instance, this woman whose sin was lust, or, well, we think it's lust, or it might have even been vanity, is being hung by her hair because women's hair was a symbol of their own vanity. So this was meant to, whole scene, the crap out of you. Remember, this is way before scary movies. And so seeing a scene on your way out of the church after just hearing a sermon that says, listen, if you're good and you follow our teaching, you get to go up into heaven and have everlasting bliss. And if you're bad, you get to go into the fiery, depths of hell and be tormented by demons and hung by your hair or whatever based upon your sins. That was supposed to scare the crap out of you. With some of these scenes now, and some of these I'm going to go through fairly quickly, but one of my agendas for today is to tell you more about some of the key stories of the Bible. And so I won't spend a ton of time in this. We're starting with the upper register that tells you the scenes of the life of the Virgin Mary, because these don't turn up again in later works of art. All I want to say about this is we're looking at a scene here, and these are all listed in your lecture guide, that's called Joachim's expulsion, or Joachim expelled from the temple. Joachim and Saint Anne are the father and mother of the Virgin Mary, and they're Jewish, right? All of this comes out of Jewish tradition. The whole Old Testament is Judaic text. And for Jews, having children was really important. It's kind of prominent in their teaching and in their culture. Now, Joachim and Anna are well past their prime, which you can see here. Here's Joachim. He's got a big beard, almost as big as the kind of priest of the temple here. And he hasn't had a child yet. And that's juxtaposed with this young man who's being blessed inside. And because he hasn't had a child yet, the priest is just like, I don't know what's wrong with you, but clearly God hasn't shined his favor on you, and you're kicked out of the temple. Now, so, this sets up the story going forward, but I want to say a number of things about the style here. Remember, we talked about the period style, and we're going to start doing a little bit of what we call a formal or visual analysis, looking at the way that this is represented in visual form. So for the style, we see, right, we're going to get up close here, we see Joachim, who's represented fairly naturalistically, at least in his face. And you'll notice as we keep looking at scenes from the Scroveni Chapel, the naturalism keeps getting better because Giotto keeps kind of practicing as he goes along. The body's still fairly stylistic. We don't see anything underneath this drapery very much, but we see that greater degree of naturalism. We also see an attempt by the artist to show believable space. These figures are actually in an interior, overlapped by forms in front of them, and so that's more believable. We also said that these are supposed to be didactic, be educatory. Remember, the entire chapel is to educate you in the stories of the Bible, so that's certainly here. And the final one is, look at the emotions here. He's being kicked out, and he clearly looks, sad about it, maybe even a little bit angry about it. And that's being emphasized here as well. Now, the artist at this stage, Giotto doesn't understand linear perspective, which we'll get to later. He's not even very good at converging lines yet to make this Templar structure look accurate. It looks all wonky, right? He doesn't understand how that works. That won't be invented until the 1400s, or rediscovered rather, in the 1400s. And all I mean by that is, we're not going to talk about linear perspective today, but you all know that if you're going to represent train tracks and you're going to make them going away from you, things that are parallel tend to appear to converge if they are moving away from us. And he doesn't quite get that either. But he does have emotion, doesn't he? Now, the one area of symbolism that I want to emphasize here is he's carrying a little lamb in his hands. That would have been used as an offering to the temple in Judaic times, but here it is a symbol of Christ, who is understood as the shepherd of us all and as our sacrificial lamb. He sacrifices himself for us, and that's why that is included. Remember, symbolism in art we call iconography. Once Joachim gets kicked out of the temple, he has to go off into the wilderness. Now, every time you hear about the wilderness in the Bible, that means anywhere outside of the city, and he's taken in this case, by a couple of shepherds. But I just ask you to look and pause at this for a moment. One of the ways that the artist is able to communicate what's going on here, and all the other stylistics remain the same, right? Greater degrees of naturalism, more realistic looking figures. We actually have trees in a background and so forth. He hasn't quite gotten goat and sheep right. They all look weird, like little elongated dogs, but he'll get better at this. And this really is supposed to be a dog, by the way. One of the things that's most interesting about this is the emotions to it. We don't even need to know much about the story to understand how Joachim feels. I mean, look at his body posture. He looks ashamed. He looks, saddened to be kicked out. And look at the shepherds here. Look at this guy. He's like, I don't know, Bob, should we accept this guy in? He looks a little shady to me. You get that suspicion on his face. You can enter into the narrative really easily. Again, I'm going quickly over these stories because they don't turn back again, but the long and short of this is while Joachim's out in the wilderness, somehow his wife, Saint Anne, gets pregnant. And the Catholic Church interpreted this as being that God actually sent Mary to earth, that Mary wasn't actually created through sexual intercourse between Joachim and Anna, but was a gift of God to this barren couple. And was sent to them so that she could be this vessel for Christ coming to earth. So while Joachim is out in the desert, he hears the story that his wife is pregnant, and he returns to her. And this story is called the Golden Gate, where they kiss at the Golden Gate. And this is the moment that he recognizes that she is pregnant, that they're going to bear this child. As the story goes on, and again, I'm cutting through this fairly quickly. Of course, Mary grows up to be an exceptional child. She's incredibly religious. They don't tell any of this in this tale, but here in this chapel, you'll see it later on, way later on in the Baroque period. But she's exceptional and she's highly religious. At the age of 14, it's that young, she is visited by the angel Gabriel. And you see Gabriel over here on the left-hand side in the so-called Annunciation scene. Up above is God or Christ on his throne in heaven, flanked by angels. And he announces to her, and notice how this takes place over a doorway. This is the most sacred space of this church, the apse space, with the altar down below this. And remember, Mary is a doorway for not only Christ coming into heaven, but Christ being a door so we can go to heaven. So the artist is making use of that architecture. He tells her she's going to become pregnant. As she hears this, she incarnates Christ, which you see the light kind of shining up above, and he's incarnating Christ. I'm just cutting out the door here so you can see this a little bit better. I'm going to get up a little bit closer on this, on Mary in particular. One of the ways that you can start to see the way, and by the way, all of this stuff, these are old frescoes, so they get damaged, and this is the beginning of the restoration of these. One of the most interesting things you can figure out about how people thought at a particular time is how they represent these stories. So, I mean, just think, if you're 13 years old and you hear that you're pregnant, and oh my God, the Father is God the Father, how are you going to respond? Probably not like this. She just bends down on a knee. And by the way, in the Bible, this is exactly what she does. She's totally ready for it, and she is accepting of this. She's ready for that task. If an artist wants to play up the human element of this, though, they might show her responding with a little bit of surprise before she immediately embraces it. Here, though, they want to show her as ready for this, as exceptional, not necessarily totally human. Now I'm going to slow down a little bit on these stories because some of them keep coming back, and I want us to know what these stories are, why they're significant, and also to be able to, as we go forward, compare and contrast some of the different ways that artists represent these stories. So the Virgin Mary incarnates the Christ, right? And now she's pregnant and she needs a husband. So this scene is the marriage of the Virgin, and of course the sacred the sacrament of holy matrimony is a huge part of the Christian church. So obviously for Catholics and for Christians in general, sexual activity is something that can only occur for people who are bonded by the sacrament of holy matrimony with a church official there. This is, again, Christian belief systems, not my belief systems at all, but this is the way that they thought of things. So she needs to become married so as to have someone along with her. to help take care of her as a young mother. Now, not anyone will do, and so the way that they choose a mate for the Virgin Mary is that the church ordains the special woman who's supposed to be bearing the Son of God. Anyone who is suiting for her, and this sounds weirdly Freudian, I don't know where this comes from, is asked to bring their rods, which seem to be rods of some kind of flower, like some kind of, I don't know, like some branch with flowering leaves on it, to the temple and to lay their rods on the temple, and whoever's rod flowers, and you see this one has flowered while these others have not, is the person that has been chosen by God to be Mary's husband. And so the person whose rod flowers here is, we all know this, Joseph, who's a much older man than the Virgin Mary, but a good guy, and God has chosen him. So we see that occurring here. Over here, you see the other suitors who have not been chosen being angry, but being angry in a fairly kind of rational way. We'll find this becoming more and more important. People don't act, if they're good people, exuberantly angry or even exuberantly happy. They'll show a little bit of emotion, but they tend to try to hold that emotion in check. That's the belief system of the West. You heard it when you were a little kid, right? You get angry, stop, calm yourself, think your way through it, be rational in your response. And so even though this guy is breaking over his knee, one of his rod because it didn't flower, he doesn't look all that angry. Now to some of the symbolism. Remember, the stylistics are the same. We see fairly natural forms here, modeling, chiaroscuro. We see fairly believable space here. Obviously, the whole thing's meant to be didactic and so forth. But we've got symbolism that you wouldn't be aware of. One of the first ones is, remember the dome? Well, there's that dome space, and who is central under the dome? The Virgin Mary. What that is meaning to say to you is she is the most holy of all the figures here. Second most holy is the priest, who is a little off center, not quite under the dome, but still directly in this space. And then a little less holy, because he's kind of half in, half out, is Joseph here. Less holy, all these suitors over here. Another form of symbolism is, and this comes from medieval manuscripts, figures who the artist wants you to understand have traveled a long distance are oftentimes cropped by the frame of the visual image. So these figures who have come from far, the way we would understand that they came from far is that they're cropped by the frame here. Marriage, something that's very familiar, especially not too long after Christmas, is the nativity scene. A nativity scene is a scene in which the Christ child is visited by shepherds and the three magi. You see the shepherds already here, so as to be kind of acknowledged as the Son of God. The Virgin Mary is given birth, but notice how there's very little indication of real human birth. A little indication of what looks like maybe a bed, but not much more than that. She's already got all her clothes on, and Christ has already been swaddled. The other figures that you always see at the nativity scene are actually not a part of the Bible, but part of kind of popular apocrypha, and that's the ox and the ass. The way that this is understood on the one hand is that even the animals understand this is God made human. And the other symbolism is that the ox is usually identified as the New Testament, you know, the books of the Bible that start with the time of Christ and the Gospels. And the ass is understood as the Old Testament, all those books that were Judaic texts originally that they're then incorporated by Christianity. You can see that the shepherds came from afar because they're cropped off by the edge of this. And then something that needs a little explanation. This is a weird contraption, isn't it? It's half like a grotto or cave and half a manger. And the reason for that is that there are conflicting kind of versions in the Bible, the Gospels, and in popular literature about where Christ was actually born. Some say a manger, others say a grotto. And so here's Giotto not knowing which one to do and turning this into a kind of grotto manger. He's going to cover all his bases here. By the way, you should just know that Joseph, who's here in the foreground, is almost always kind of the odd man out. He's never quite, understands what's going on necessarily. And here he's already asleep, as if he had a really tough job giving birth. But to show you that naturalism. Human glance between the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. Now he still looks like a weird little alien in some way. But the fact that they're looking at each other and really have some kind of tender exchange of glances is totally unlike what you would find in medieval painting. Scenes from the Bible. I don't think we see this one again in this class, but just to kind of reference it quickly. Some of you know that after Christ is born, word spreads that there's the Son of God is on earth and he's going to become king on earth. And this threatens the powers that exist in the world, including the Romans and the ruler of Jerusalem. By the way, Jerusalem is actually controlled by the Romans, but this is the kind of puppet dictator known as Herod. And Herod, just not knowing who Jesus is, decides that the best way to make sure that this young, infant doesn't grow up to usurp his power is to kill all the infants of a particular age, thus making sure that he got the right one. This story is known as the Massacre of the Innocents. And so you see Herod up above, and you see these emissaries of Herod killing all of these babies, and there's basically a big pile of dead babies in the foreground here, and all the women who these babies have been taken away from crying, showing excessive emotion as they lose their children, as they should. Just to mark who the good and the bad guys are in the story, right? Good and bad show you that emotion, show you a lot more realism in these figures. Notice how bad Giotto is at representing babies. Man, that is a gigantic child. If she gave birth to this child, she should be glorified just as much as the Virgin Mary. By the way, if you're wondering about this, so originally this guy would have been holding something, as would have the guy before here. It was probably painted on after the plaster dried and has since worn away. So this is probably a spear or a sword, and this is a whip over here, but they've since worn off. So now we're down in that middle register, the life and the ministry of Jesus Christ. And in that register, some of the key parts of course, the Bible are his many miracles. And one of his most famous miracles is the so-called raising of Lazarus. In this story, Jesus is away, and Lazarus, who is a distant relative, is dying, and word is sent to Jesus, but he can't get there in time, and Lazarus dies. When Jesus finally shows up, and it's like 3 days later, this is important because it's based upon Christian symbolism. Jesus will spend 3 days in the tomb before he is resurrected. So when Jesus actually gets there, he tells everyone, don't worry, open the door and I will call forth Lazarus. I will bring him back to life, basically. And people don't believe him yet. And so even in the Bible, it tells that they were worried about this, and they covered their noses. And you see people covering their noses because one assumes that, a body that has been placed in a tomb for 3 days in the Middle East is pretty ripe. And they don't quite believe him. But when he calls him forth, and see Lazarus here, who's been wrapped up almost like a mummy, Lazarus comes back to life, and everyone bows down and understands Jesus as the actual Messiah, not just a prophet, but God made human, and a person who has the power over life and death. And his reputation builds based upon these miracles that he's performing. Those important stories, and you'll see a number of representations of this. We're not going to spend much time with this, but I will give you the basics of it. Is the story of the Last Supper. Near the end of Jesus' life, before he is executed, he gathers together his closest followers, known as his apostles. There are 12 of them. And two things happen at this Last Supper. Number one, he tells them that one of them will betray him. And that's what's going on here. He's just announced, and remember how important this is, his closest followers, they all believe him to be God on earth. He tells them one of them will betray him to his death. And you can see them all kind of looking suspiciously at one another, while John the Evangelist, who is his closest follower, embraces him. Some people wonder, here's Jesus's halo. Why is it all gold and these are all black? Well, originally all these halos are put in with gold leaf, and over the ages, people have stolen that. So in between times that the people who now own this place can replace that gold leaf, they're oftentimes black here. We don't know who Judas Iscariot is. Some people believe it's this figure over here through which the edge of this pole goes, but it's not quite clear. He is the betrayer. The other thing that's not pictured here that happens at the Last Supper, which we'll talk about more when we get there, is that the sacrament of the Holy Communion is started. And this is a major, major ritual in the Catholic Church, the Holy Mass, in which at the Last Supper, Jesus transforms the wine on the table into his blood and the bread on the table into his body, and those who have been purified through baptism can eat this and literally take Christ, or basically the Spirit of Christ, into themselves. And that's one of the most important, sacraments in the Holy Church, especially for Catholics. But that's not what's being pictured here. What's being pictured here is a very human moment. Scene in the Bible is that the way that Christ is identified is that in the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas, who you see here, kisses him. He's already told the Romans that when he kisses a figure, that is how he'll identify Christ. And you can see all hell breaking loose when this occurs. Jesus looks right back at him. Judas here looks, and I'm going to get in here up close a little bit, looks kind of ugly. And this is the first time you've seen this kind of representation. He looks almost animalistic. It will become kind of standard procedure that people who are understood to be more godly are made prettier or more beautiful, and those that are sinners are made to look ugly. This goes back to classical Greece, frankly, and it will be adopted by artists of the Renaissance. So Jesus just looks calmly back at him as Judas looks pretty, animalistic. All around him, by the way, one of the ways that artists can illusion of movement is by using a lot of diagonal forms. Forms that are vertical and horizontal are really stable. They don't look like much movement. But look at the torches and the spears and clubs and so forth, all going at angles. It gives you the idea of movement and frenzy occurring, which is exactly what it would have happened after Christ has been identified as Christ and is taken as a prisoner. This then leads to the so-called Stations of the Cross, or the last part of the Passion of Christ, where he is tortured, forced to carry his cross to Golgotha, and then is executed. And that's what you see here. This is the crucifixion scene. Now, this is kind of halfway between a human representation of Christ and one that glorifies the heck out of Christ. In other words, it doesn't show him undergoing excessive amounts of agony, nor does it make him totally beyond agony. And this will make more sense as we see more representations of this. And it's filled with a lot of different subjects. So in the center, remember what this means to Christians. It means that Christ is sacrificing himself for our own salvation. He's wiped away original sin, and now we all get to go to heaven. On his right-hand side are the most important figures. Prominently displayed in the center is the Virgin Mary, who is swooned, right? Her eyes are closed. She's basically fainted. She's identifiable because she's all in blue. And also the artist has made her most prominent by showing so much of her body. She faces us frontally, which is a very commanding pose versus these other figures that are mostly in profile. Next to her is John the Evangelist in red. He's almost always going to be at a crucifixion because not only was he the most beloved follower of Jesus, but Jesus gave him the task of taking care of the Virgin Mary after his execution. These other figures I refer to as the nondescript Marys. There are a whole host of other women who are distantly related or directly related to the Virgin Mary who sometimes accompany her in these scenes just to kind of fill in space. Obviously up above and all being very emotive, they're all kind of crying and swooning, are these angels who can't bear to see Jesus dying. And at his feet, prominent in the depiction of the crucifixion, is Mary Magdalene. Now, Mary Magdalene is a composite of a number of figures from the Bible, but for Christians of this time, she would have been understood as a woman who came to Christ as a sinner. And her sin is usually identified as being a prostitute, which is something that is in the iconography of Mary Magdalene, in that long, beautiful hair was seen as a symbol of woman's passion. If you wanted to represent a woman who was sexualized, you show a lot of hair, and that becomes the symbol of Mary Magdalene. The other reason we can identify her is that when she first comes to Jesus, she falls at her feet and begs his forgiveness. She cries at his feet and she washes his feet with her hair. And you see her here crying at his feet, which identifies her as such. She is, Mary Magdalene, more often than not, symbolic of the repentant sinner. That means she's admitted her sins and she repents them and she's going to make up for them through penance to become better. And of course, that's a big idea in Catholicism. Everyone's a sinner, but people can be redeemed if they admit their sins and work hard to change them. Off to the left-hand side of Christ, I'm not going to go into this here because it doesn't show up again, are the soldiers dicing for Christ's cloak. They want to own it, so they gamble for it, which is something gambling is associated with the devil. While Joseph of Arimathea, who you'll see come back later, tries to talk him out of it. The final little thing I want to say about the symbolism is you probably noticed at the base of the cross is a skull. That skull represents or is symbolic of the place that Christ was crucified. Golgotha literally means place of the skulls. So that's why that was included. And some people would even say that the skull that is here is actually the skull of Adam, the first man, who was buried on Golgotha, and from whom Christ is redeeming us, because Adam and Eve, of course, sinned in the Garden of Eden. After Christ dies, you get these incredibly emotive scenes of what's called the lamentation, or the lament over the death of Christ. Here we see all that naturalism again, believable figures in believable space. This pathway, the mountain way going back into the distance, is actually using pretty accurate converging lines. You see a lot of emotion. You know, the figures look believable in their space and so forth. It's one of the most well-known scenes from the Scroveni Chapel. And again, remember, off here, anyone cut off by the frame of the picture will have had to travel long distances to pay their respects to Christ. Once again, the Virgin Mary is right up near his face in blue, given a prominent place, right, all on his own, no one overlapping him much, is John the Evangelist crying about this, and at his feet, once again, Mary Magdalene. Human anguish here. There's nothing like this that I'm aware of in the medieval period, or certainly not very many examples. And this is the starting point for that kind of human representation of in this case, religious figures. Of course, many of you know, after 3 days and 3 nights in his tomb, they go to check on it, and he's no longer there. This is his resurrection scene. The first to recognize Christ, believe it or not, is Mary Magdalene. And she goes to embrace him, but when she tries to embrace him, he says, "No, you can't touch me because I no longer am of this world. I am ascending to heaven," and that's called the the noli me tangere scene. It literally means no, you can't touch me scene. And it's supposed to be this kind of last moment in which, it's to tug our heartstrings. Here's our Lord, but he no longer is here for us. He has to go to heaven, and we'll miss him, but he is the Lord as proven by his resurrection. Now, finally, I wanted to emphasize this. We won't have time to do this for all of these, but notice how these things correspond with one another. They're called typologies or prefigurations, and sometimes people use, or artists use, stories from the Old Testament to show the typology of the New Testament. But here what we're doing is we're showing, for instance, in the scene of the raising of Lazarus, that Christ has the power over life and death, and that of course he's going to resurrect later on. They correspond, these two things. And then you'll probably see over here, and I'm going to get us in a little bit closer on this, in these designs in between the different panels, in a design called a quatrefoil, this kind of four-leaf clover form that comes out of medieval times, we see the creation of man. And again, these are all built around the idea that God and the Son of God, who is basically God made human, have the power over life and death, including our own, in their ability to take us into heaven. You can see everywhere. I'm just going to get us up close here. On this scene of the Lamentation, off to the side, in what is a typology of the Old Testament, and this quatrefoil is a what looks like a fish eating a human being. That, of course, is the story from the Old Testament of Jonah and the whale. In the Old Testament, Jonah is given a task by God to go save people. He shirks his duty and leaves on a boat. The people on the boat, because the boat starts to drift in the doldrums and they can't get any, they're not moving anywhere, throw Jonah overboard, where he is immediately swallowed by a whale. He lives in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, and then is reborn in order to go off and save the people he was originally supposed to save. Christians believe this is a foreshadowing, or what's called a typology, of Christ, right? It comes from the Old Testament. These are all Judaic texts, but it's understood to prophesy Christ coming because it so corresponds with the story of Christ. To kind of lead us out of this story, remember right down there below the 3 registers, in between the pews, are scenes of the 7 holy virtues and venal vices. These are things that are, on the one hand, the virtues are, their moral code that we're supposed to emulate. So these are all painted in grisaille, all in gray tones to mimic the look of sculpture. And in this case, we see a symbol of justice. Here we see another virtue, a symbol of fortitude. We see one of the vices here, this is the vice of envy. And envy is coveting what other people have, even though you have something. So she clutches, for instance, a bag full of coins, but her hand clasps out for something else, reaching for something else. Because she always wants what she can't have, it's her senses that tell her that she doesn't have enough. So she has gigantic ears, which, by the way, might even be a reference to King Minos. And then out of her mouth and biting her in the eyes, because what you see is what you want, is a snake, which is associated, of course, with the devil. And the whole thing burns her up in flames. This is a sin that will lead you, if you are envious of other people, to hell. And of desperation here, suicide, right? Well, hopefully this gave you a pretty good primer of the early Renaissance, and gave you a fairly decent primer of some of the key stories of the Bible that we'll see over and again, frankly, throughout this quarter, although we'll be focusing in on how those scenes are represented quite differently. So just to recap, remember, key to this lecture, the context, the rise of the middle class and interest in humanism, drawn from ancient classical Greece and Rome, the mass immigrations of the populace from Constantinople or the Orthodox Church back to Italy, bringing with them these things. The stylistics of the early Renaissance, right? You should know those, have those under your belt, and understand how these works of art exemplify those stylistics. And I will see you next week when we talk about the early Northern Renaissance, meaning what's happening in this case almost 100 years later, because a massive plague, by the way, hits Italy and actually parts of other Western Europe as well, and stops a lot of artistic production during the time period. But the Northern Renaissance is what's happening in areas that are today Belgium and the Netherlands, but mainly Belgium, during the 1400s. All right, have a good week, and I'll see you next week.